Unidentified flying objects, UFOs. They appear as sleek metallic discs in daylight skies or mysterious shapes that illuminate the night. Where do UFOs come from? What do they want? Are they merely inventions of the modern age? If so, why do they appear in early paintings? If UFOs are kites or planes or weather balloons, why do they move like nothing else from Earth? The extraordinary answers to these age-old questions, next. UFOs are now hauntingly familiar. They have shared our skies for an uneasy 50 years. Eyewitness accounts testify to their breathtaking speed, unparalleled maneuverability, and uncanny silence. They are different than any aircraft made here on Earth. These stealthy visitors are called UFOs, unidentified flying objects. They have shown up unexpectedly in photographs taken all across the globe. Yet if we turn back the pages of history, there are intriguing hints that UFOs have been with us all along. Perhaps even as far back as 12,000 years ago, when our ancestors found shelter in the darkness of caves. The walls of these primitive dwellings were often painted with figures of hunters and the animals they hoped to snare. Recently, other images have come to light. These tracings were made from caves in France and Spain, and they show pictures not ordinarily associated with hunting.
Their shapes are very peculiar because they do oftentimes look like UFOs and saucers. And I'm not saying that they are UFOs, that they do represent craft of any type, only that they have a similarity to what we now perceive as maybe craft from another planet as UFOs. And one wonders where the cave people were getting the impetus for putting these on their walls. Obviously, putting paintings on cave walls was a laborious process, and you would only put down the most important things of your daily life. And here these objects appear not once, not twice, but fairly numerous times on the cave walls.
The advance of civilization brought us out of caves and into cities. Some 4,000 years ago, scribes recorded what sounds like the sighting of UFOs during the reign of a pharaoh named Thutmose III.
In the year 22 of the third month of the winter, a circle of fire appeared in the sky. After some days, it became more numerous and shone with the brightness of the sun, extending to the very limits of the heavens. Royal Records of Thutmose III, 1480 BC.
A millennium later, young Alexander the Great conquered his way across the known world. In 332 BC, he laid siege to the Phoenician city of Tyre, and accounts from both sides report that shield-shaped silver objects appeared in the sky. One supposedly sent down a beam of light that destroyed the city walls. Even the Bible itself contains passages that some say refer to alien spacecraft.
I looked, and behold, a stormy wind came from the north, a great cloud with fire flashing through it, and a radiance round about it, while out of the midst of it gleamed something with a luster like that of shining metal. Ezekiel, verse 1.
There are a number of reports from the past, and I believe that some of them are quite legitimate. But one of the things is you can't interview witnesses, of course. You can't get independent witnesses. You can't ask, well, what angle was it above the horizon? The problem we have with them is we have to take them totally at face value.
It's always important in looking at these to remember that there are a lot of strange astronomical phenomena that only occur once in a while, like a star going supernova and suddenly appearing in the sky, or a comet which appeared unexpectedly. And so you always have to look at these from the point of view of astronomy. There could be some atmospheric phenomenon or an astronomical phenomenon that they were depicting as something supernatural.
As the scientific awareness of the population grew, superstition was replaced by knowledge of what was actually going on in the heavens. However, when an object would fly across the sky and stop, or hover, or seemingly descend to the ground, or maybe exhibit many different color changes or change shape or what have you, then even those people knew that they were looking at something out of the ordinary.
The residents of Nuremberg, Germany, had just such an experience on April 4th, 1561. On that day, the skies above the city filled with a chaotic array of tube-shaped objects and balls of light. Eyewitnesses called it a frightful spectacle. Chronicles of the time also report extraordinary displays over Basel, Switzerland, during the summer of 1566. These events were depicted in primitive woodcuts made by eyewitnesses. However, it was the talented master artists that have left us the most fascinating images. In 1998, an Italian writer named Daniela Giordano earned an award for her landmark study of the enigmatic flying objects depicted by Renaissance artists.
She discovered that not only did the artist have these objects in the picture, but he also had people looking at these objects and shielding their eyes, as though the people were actually noting with amazement that something unusual was in the sky. It's unknown why the object's there, but it does appear, and it looks like a UFO.
This apparently traditional religious work is known as the Madonna and Saint Giovanni. Here, too, a witness to the flying object is placed unobtrusively, yet unmistakably, in the background.
And it's very obvious that this person's attention is directed to the flying object. And the artist obviously wanted viewers of the painting to see that not only is there the Madonna in the painting, but that there's also an object in the background.
Curious airborne craft show up in other media as well. These tapestries from the 1500s depict the life of the Virgin Mary. Lurking in the background is the familiar shape of a 1950s-style UFO. This fresco from a 14th century monastery in Kosovo prominently features what appears to be a flying vehicle. On this French coin, minted in 1680, a ray of light beams down from a colossal wheel-shaped object. Sporadic sightings continue to be recorded for the next 250 years. In the 1940s, World War II pilots joined the long list of UFO eyewitnesses. Some of these pilots would later come forward to tell their stories as interest in UFOs increased after the war.
Pilots on all sides of the conflict, the Axis and the Allied pilots, reported strange objects, sometimes flying off the wingtips of their airplanes, and seemingly exhibit intelligent maneuvering. If you tried to fly the airplane toward it, the object would fly along with you and just keeping off the wing, or dive down or fly above. You couldn't catch up with it.
I talked to a pilot of a B-24 bomber during World War II, and he said one circled around their airplane. Round, smooth, sleek. They all expected to die instantly because this must be a new German secret weapon and it was going to shoot them down. We sure don't have anything that looks like that and flies like that.
I have one account where they actually fired at it and they seemingly went through it. They didn't damage the object at all. Allied pilots thought they were secret weapons of the Germans. Germans thought they were secret weapons of the Allies, England and America, and they were even seen in the Pacific theater.
However, after the war, it became clear that neither the Allies nor the Axis had produced these super aircraft. Someone else had.
And they did exhibit maneuvering that, again, was much like the types of objects that were seen immediately after the war ended and called flying saucers at that time.
Many believe that in July of 1947, near the top-secret airbase at Roswell, New Mexico, the United States military finally got a close-up look at these mysterious spacecraft.
The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army.
UFOs Then and Now will return in a moment here on the History Channel. In the fall of 1945, American boys came home to a hard-earned welcome. They had faced unspeakable horrors. Now they would head for suburbia and get started on the baby boom. At the same time, another new era was dawning, the age of flying saucers. The enigmatic spacecraft that had appeared from time to time through the centuries would now take center stage. The age of innocence was over. The wave of modern UFO sightings began simply, with no photos, no radar returns, and no physical evidence. Just a story told by one man at the right time in history. Kenneth Arnold was a 32-year-old successful businessman on the summer day that his sighting took place. He sold firefighting equipment and flew his own light plane. On Tuesday, June 24th, 1947, Arnold was flying toward Mount Rainier above the Cascade Mountains of Washington State. The air was smooth and clear as he reached 9,200 feet and noticed a bright flash. To the left and north of Mount Rainier, Arnold saw what he described as 9 unusual aircraft flying at over 1,200 miles per hour. As they passed the mountain, the objects were outlined against the snow. They traveled in a V formation and skittered across the sky in such a way that Arnold said they resembled a saucer skipping across water. Arnold first told his story upon landing at the Yakima, Washington airport. He sketched a series of diagrams to illustrate what he had seen. What he drew was shaped like a crescent, 50 feet long and only 3 feet thick. It had a rounded point in the rear. When seen edge on, he reported, it looked like a black line. It wasn't long before the story of Arnold's sighting startled the world. The newspapers quickly coined a name for Arnold's skipping discs. The name was flying saucers. Kenneth Arnold was soon to enjoy a celebrity status. The author of a book and the subject of magazine cover stories, he was looked upon as a combination of space-age visionary and screwball eccentric. The press would anoint him the man who started it all. In the days and weeks after Arnold's landmark flight, flying saucers became big news. Sightings were reported across the country. Indeed, at that time, more people knew about flying saucers than about the Marshall Plan for the post-war reconstruction of Europe. But one incident above all established flying saucers in the public mind. Roswell, New Mexico lies deep in the empty expanse of the American Southwest. Today, its very name conjures up memories of a supposed UFO crash and government cover-up. It is remembered as the Roswell incident. In the summer of 1947, the Army airfield in Roswell was home to the elite 509th Bomb Group. During World War II, the B-29s that carried atom bombs to Hiroshima and Nagasaki had originated here, and so would an event that gave substance to the belief in flying saucers.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army. Army officers say the missile, found sometime last week, has been inspected at Roswell, New Mexico, and sent to Wright Field, Ohio, for further inspection.
Walter Hott was Public Information Officer of the 509th Bomb Group. He was the official instructed to dispatch press releases to the radio station and newspapers in Roswell. The story fed the imagination of the country, but has been the source of controversy ever since.
The press release that I'd received stated that we had in our possession parts of a crashed flying disc. The material was found on a ranch north of Roswell.
Then the story abruptly changed. General Roger Ramey took command of the Roswell situation and issued a new statement. It wasn't a flying disc after all.
To me, I think it was one of the slickest cover-ups by admitting that we had the material, and then a higher authority says, no, you don't.
Flying saucer or weather balloon? Both Air Force stories couldn't be true. One fact was undisputed. Something had crashed at Roswell. A rancher named Mac Brazel discovered the metallic debris in this isolated rangeland outside of town. The wreckage was strewn over more than half a mile, and Brazel alerted the base, assuming a military plane had crashed. Jesse Marcel Jr. recalls that his father, the intelligence officer at the Roswell Army Airfield, had been dispatched to the debris site to determine what had crashed there.
The night that my dad came home, he was very excited. He woke my mother and myself up and said he wanted to show us something very strange. And as I recall, he said this was parts of a flying saucer. I was 11, almost 12 at the time, and I had seen pieces of an airplane and weather balloons and things like that, but this was not like anything that I'd ever seen before. And the most intriguing portion of the debris that I recall seeing was what appeared to be I-beams. When I looked at this with the light reflecting on it, I noticed what appeared to be some symbols or writing along the inner surface of this I-beam. And the implication was this was something that came from some other planetary system.
Author Kevin Randall researched the Roswell incident and learned more about the debris Major Marcel had collected.
You have something called metal foil, been described by various people as like tin foil or lead foil. You wad it up into a ball, you drop it on the table, it unfolds itself and there's no sign of a crease.
Randall interviewed some people who say they actually handled the mysterious wreckage back in 1947.
It was all wadded up when he dropped it, and when he dropped it on the table and it hit the table, it spread out just like it was water. And so they all started holding it and playing with it, and they were trying to cut it with their knives, and they tried to burn it with their lighters, and they couldn't do any damage to it at all.
Frankie Rowe's father was a lieutenant in the Roswell Fire Department. She recalls visiting the station at the age of 12 when her father and the other firemen inspected the strange metal.
So it made the circle of all the firemen that were standing around the table, and everybody did what they wanted to do, and it was laying there, and I reached over and I picked it up. And I sat there and played with it for a while, just wadding it up and dropping it. And when I was holding it in my hand, I couldn't feel it in my hand.
Randall discovered evidence that a thorough cleanup of the debris site took place under security so tight, even the sheriff was not allowed entry.
What we understand is you have riflemen on the high points around there facing outward. You've got men cleaning the debris field, putting the material in wheelbarrows, moving it to collection points so they can be put into trucks brought back. Eventually, they crawled across the area shoulder to shoulder, picking up all the little bits and pieces they could find.
There were also rumors of a second crash site, with even more stunning discoveries. Frankie Rowe's father said that the fire department was called to the scene. There, he had observed nothing less than actual extraterrestrial beings.
They'd gotten a call on what they thought was a plane crash about 30 miles north of Roswell. And when they got out there, it was not an airplane. He said it was a flying saucer that had crashed. And there were what he called little people. And he said one of them was still alive. That there were two that were covered up laying on the ground. And he said they had been covered up, it looked like with body bags. And the one that was walking around there didn't appear to be hurt.
Through his research, Kevin Randle has established what he believes happened next.
According to a number of the eyewitnesses, the craft and the bodies were taken to Hangar 84 at the Roswell Army Airfield, where they were held for a period of time before the various flights were initiated and sent out of Roswell.
Randall believes that crates containing the alien bodies and flying saucer wreckage were shipped out of the heavily guarded Hangar 84, never to be seen again. When the Air Force produced one meager weather balloon at the Roswell crash debris, many concluded it was part of a cover-up.
In the 50s, there was the belief that the U.S. Air Force had proof of some sort that these were alien spaceships and was covering it up to prevent panic.
There obviously was a cover-up of this accident, because years later my dad said he was actually part of the cover-up because he went along with the weather balloon story.
Indeed, according to Marcel, his father revealed that he had been ordered to pose with wreckage from a weather balloon.
My dad explained to my mother that this was a non-event. Don't even discuss it with your friends. Don't talk about it. I was a true Air Force brat. I believed in following the orders, you know. He didn't want me to talk about it, so we did not talk about it.
These people were visited by military authorities. They were told to keep quiet.
Frankie Rowe recalls such a visit from a man in a uniform.
He started getting louder, and he kept saying, "Don't you understand? You did not see anything." And he had a nightstick type of thing with him that was kind of hanging on his belt. And he took that out, and he got very loud, and he started talking, and every time he would make a point, he would hit his hand with the nightstick. So he would say, "You didn't see anything, you were not there." And he said, "If you ever say one word about this the rest of your life, we will split up this family. If that's not enough," he said, "you know, this is a big desert out here. We can take you out in the desert." And he said, "No one will ever find your bodies."
If this disturbing account is true, it can only be described as a death threat, a warning to remain silent about the Roswell incident. What was so vital to protect? In January of 1948, the Air Force would launch an investigation into the escalating flood of UFO reports. UFOs Then and Now will return in a moment here on the History Channel. Something crashed at Roswell, New Mexico. But whether the object that fell from the sky in July of 1947 originated here on Earth or somewhere in outer space has been hotly debated for more than a half-century. Perhaps it truly was a weather balloon, as the Air Force insists. If so, that would deflate one of the seminal events in the history of UFOs. However, if the object was in fact extraterrestrial, the issue then becomes, what business did it have at Roswell? At the time of the Roswell crash, New Mexico was host to the most advanced military and scientific experiments on the face of the planet. In fact, the Roswell area was the only place in the world where testing of cutting-edge radar, rockets, and nuclear weapons could all be found. Perhaps these lurking UFOs had become a threat to national security. The Air Force quietly began investigating the rash of post-war sightings in January of 1948. This inquiry was codenamed Project Sign, and by October, it would reach a truly stunning conclusion.
Project Sign wrote a final report called The Estimate of the Situation, which concluded that UFOs were interplanetary vehicles. You can imagine that this didn't go over well at the Pentagon. The government could not have the idea of UFOs as interplanetary spacecraft coming out when they've been trying to cover up the Roswell crash.
It went all the way to the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, who said, I don't find this document particularly persuasive. He batted it back down and fired practically everybody in Project Sign. The people who were left at Project Sign could read the handwriting on the wall. If you said they were extraterrestrial, you lost your job, your career was over.
After the purge, the inquiry was revamped as Project Grudge, a name that may have suggested a certain skepticism. An Air Force insider actually characterized Project Grudge as the dark ages of UFO investigation. In August of 1951, this V-shaped pattern of objects appeared over Texas and became known as the Lubbock Lights. Grudge said it was a flock of birds reflecting the glow of the city. This film was submitted from Great Falls, Montana in 1950. It depicts bright white dots moving behind the smokestacks of a grain mill. The photographer described the objects as shiny, bright, and metallic, like polished silver. Project Grudge concluded that they were F-94 Air Force interceptors landing nearby. After 3 years of debunking UFO reports, Grudge was reorganized into the supposedly more objective Project Blue Book.
Blue Book became the focus for public attention and press attention, but it was never scientific, it was never comprehensive. They didn't have radar, they didn't have computers, they didn't have people ready to go up, an aircraft with instruments to monitor UFO sightings. Typically, an officer, a sergeant, several secretaries, their job was primarily to try to tell us that there was nothing to flying saucers.
Major Hector Quintanilla Jr. became Blue Book director in 1963.
The objectives of the program are twofold. They're the same as they have been since 1953 when the regulation was written. First of all, to try to determine if the UFO phenomena presents a threat to the security of the United States. And second, to determine if the UFO phenomena exhibits any technological advances which could be channeled into research and development.
Many of the UFO reports were easily explainable as atmospheric anomalies, like this saucer-shaped lenticular cloud formation. The man who shot this film, a Navy officer and aerial photographer, claimed he saw these objects up close before getting out his camera. He said they were disc-shaped and gunmetal colored. Blue Book determined they were high-flying birds. Astronomer J. Allen Hynek, a Blue Book consultant for its entire 16-year run, had this assessment of the project. Quote, when Major Quintanilla came in, the flag of the utter nonsense school was flying at its highest. Blue Book's most notorious nonsense came in March of 1966, when it dismissed a wave of credible sightings, including many by policemen, as swamp gas. In December of 1969, the Air Force closed down Project Blue Book and washed its hands of UFOs. Few scientists were willing to approach the subject. However, there were some who embraced UFOs without reservation. UFOs Then and Now will return in a moment here on the History Channel. During the 1950s, the Air Force stood by its finding in the Roswell case. The crash was nothing more than a weather balloon. But newsreels show a public that continue to watch the skies, hoping to glimpse a spacecraft. Suddenly, people from coast to coast began seeing UFOs. What followed was a popular movement that embraced flying saucers and the spacemen who flew them. Ready or not, the flying saucers were coming.
within a matter of several days, I will myself make what might be called a flying saucer, although I don't choose to call it that because it may not respond to our controls.
To the vast majority of the people in the late 40s and 1950s, flying saucers were a terrific novelty. And there was a great deal of popular fascination. There were cheesy science fiction films based on the idea that Martians were invading the Earth in flying saucers.
Popular magazines printed on pulp paper would hit the newsstands in time to cash in on the trend and expand it to legendary proportions. The man behind those flying saucer legends was publisher Raymond Palmer.
Palmer was a man who in his youth had been severely injured, and so he was crippled up, and he was what you would call a hunchback, I guess. He had the instincts of a carnival barker. He liked to put something over on you. And the thing about Palmer was that his fans liked having Palmer put something over on them.
It was Palmer's Fate magazine, later called Flying Saucers magazine, which helped spread the idea of UFOs in the 1950s. Spacecraft from around the universe played across these colorful pages. It was here that the UFO was finally identified. Now everyone knew they were spaceships from other worlds. What followed was a craze in the 1950s known as the contactee movement. Contactees were people who said that they had made contact with space people.
I was aboard a flying saucer in the Nevada desert on 11 different occasions. I was taken into this monstrous saucer by one of the men and confronted with a lady captain. Beautiful complexion, beautiful appearing woman, and they're peaceful people. They mean no harm to us. They come down here to investigate what's going on Earth, and they certainly convinced me that they're peaceful, and they come from another planet they call Clarion. They told me there was life on Mars and that there were life on other planets as well, and all planets except Earth had interplanetary means of travel.
The man credited with starting the contactee movement was a Polish immigrant and self-styled philosopher named George Adamski. In his book, Flying Saucers Have Landed, Adamski claimed that in 1952, he had been aboard an alien spacecraft.
So I was picked up on a desert, in California desert, and I was taken to the mothership and they were flown around, not too close to the moon, but with instruments, similar, you might say, except it wasn't a camera, it was regularly sort of a telescopic instruments that we were able to see what was on the moon on the other side of it, see?
Adamski's book detailed his meeting with a man from Venus called Orthon. There were also photographs of the spaceship he supposedly flew in. Adamski's books also reflected the political climate of the 1950s, like growing concerns about the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. When Orthon departed, he would leave behind these enigmatic footprints. Adamski said they contained a message urging an end to nuclear testing on Earth. In a similar vein, other contactees spoke of aliens from utopian planets who wanted to prevent all-out nuclear war. Best of all, these aliens looked just like us.
I have a picture here of the gentleman who escorted me through the craft, and I would like to show it and describe it. This gentleman, he appeared almost as I am, except that he was about 5 feet 10 inches tall, weighing about 150 to 155 pounds, and they all appeared about that same size, including the lady.
George Adamski would publish 2 more volumes on his contacts with beautiful space people from Saturn and Mars. He even had opportunity to take home movies of the scout ships that transported him, guided by robot pilots from Venus. The impact of Adamski's tales led to an explosion of flying saucer clubs and conventions.
As the flying saucer phenomena continued into the 50s, civilians began to become very interested, of course, people did, and clubs formed up with a classic meaning of the term club, hobbyists, as it were, that were just interested in the wilder, esoteric aspects of the phenomena, particularly the stories of people who said they were in contact with aliens.
Many of the contactees would gather at the largest flying saucer festival of all time. It took place in California at a place called Giant Rock in March of 1954. It attracted over 5,000 outer space enthusiasts.
How many trips have you made to outer space?
Well, I'd say 350 or a few more.
When was the last one?
Well, first part of June.
And who did you go with?
Well, people from Jupiter.
I have made telepathic contact for the past 8 years with many space people from many areas of space, both inside and outside of the solar system.
Lectures were given from the Giant Rock, and stalls were set up to sell books, photos, and space-age souvenirs. Most importantly, conventions like this gave the contactees a place to exchange ideas, rumors, and reports.
But I do believe what I see. And I am one of those who was inside a flying saucer.
I seem to become one with the entire universe. Everything in the universe seemed to be contracted down to one small dot.
What were their clothes like? The woman had a radiant red box-pleated skirt and a black velvet-appearing blouse and a black and red tam or beret, and the men had clothes very similar to our Greyhound bus drivers.
Contactees also described the alien spacecraft they had seen in astonishing detail.
On July the 12th, I took a trip in a flying saucer, which I am pointing right here. The saucer was well equipped with rooms, bedrooms, bathroom, toilets, and this saucer, I went up into Mars, over the Moon, Venus, Clarion, and Orion. When I say Orion, I do not mean Orion. It is a planet outside of our galaxy.
Also popular among contactees was a belief that startling evidence was about to be revealed.
We are going to see more and more of these visitors from space, and that before too long, the evidence will be incontrovertible, that you will have on your TV screens and on your movie screens concrete evidence that the ships are here and that they are real and they're not fantastic things which have been cooked up to make a movie.
The contactee wave of the 1950s was a light-hearted sideshow to the UFO phenomenon. However, during this same period, photographs began to surface that suggested UFOs were no joke and had to be taken seriously. They are round, they are cigar-shaped, and they are cylindrical. Some appear to be sleek and smooth, as if made of stainless steel, while others appear bolted together from some alien cast iron. At night, they are described as having flashing lights. They appear without warning, streak across the sky, and disappear. Many UFO films and photographs have been identified as natural phenomenon or hoaxes. But some UFOs appear in photos when we least expect them and defy explanation.
UFO photo cases are tantalizing because they're some type of what you might think of as objective proof. The UFO phenomenon is ephemeral, and normally all we have are reports of witnesses on a piece of paper on a tape recorder. But with photos, you think you have something physical.
Indeed, photos offer some of the most convincing evidence that extraterrestrial aircraft may be real. This series of photos remains among the most compelling examples of what ufologists call a daylight disk. The photographs were taken on July 29, 1952 by George Stock outside of his lawnmower shop in Passaic, New Jersey. Stock reported that as he was working outside at 4:30 p.m., he looked up to see something unusual flying overhead. Using an inexpensive box reflex camera, he snapped pictures of what he described as a disc-shaped object with a metallic bottom. It hovered momentarily, then accelerated and flew away. All that remains of this astonishing daytime visitation are a few pictures. But are photos reliable evidence for UFOs? Dr. Bruce Maccabee is an optical physicist employed by the United States Navy. His official research involves high-energy space lasers, but his interest also lies in the detailed analysis of UFO photographs. Of particular interest to Dr. Maccabee are photos which show no evidence of a hoax or misidentification and cannot be otherwise explained. One such case began at a farm in rural Oregon in 1950.
These are two photos taken by a farmer and his wife in 1950 in McMinnville, Oregon. Here's the first photo and here's the second, and we'll get a little bit of a blow-up on these. Put them
Using image enhancement equipment, Maccabee brings into focus the startling photographs that were taken in the early evening with a simple camera.
You can see that it's an oval object with a little thing on the top, like a little protrusion at the top of it. This is obviously a hoax of the real thing. There's no halfway point. You can see the image clearly enough to see that it's not a bird or plane or Superman. So the next question is, what could it be? And if we go back over here, we can see that there are electrical wires right up above the object. Looking again at the blow-up. And now the question is there any evidence of a suspension underneath the wires?
A contrast-enhanced version of the Oregon photo reveals minute scratches that Maccabee must distinguish from a string or line that might have been attached to the object to suspend it for a hoax.
No one has found any evidence of a line going up above the object. There is a possibility that this thing might have been thrown and photographed, except that the image is not blurred by motion.
Agents of the Air Force and FBI questioned the couple who took this picture, and authorities later confiscated a copy held by the local newspaper. No one has yet explained why. This photograph is another of the more credible UFO pictures ever taken. It was snapped in Brazil by a government survey team in 1958.
A Brazilian naval photographer on a ship was there with the rest of the men when they saw an object shaped like Saturn, in other words, an object with a ring around it, flying toward an island that they were near, Trinidad Island, flying around the island and then taking off in the distance. And he snapped 4 or 5 or so or more photos of the object with literally dozens and dozens of witnesses.
The sighting lasted nearly 2 minutes. First, the object was reported to have approached the island, then it disappeared behind a mountain. It then reappeared before moving off at high speed toward the sea.
This is clearly a structure that somebody built. It doesn't look like anything that we have on Earth. There were all these witnesses who saw the picture being taken. For these reasons, the photographs are unusually evidential and have to figure in any kind of case for the reality of UFOs as somebody's technology.
Because this is a multiple witness case done by scientists and a professional photographer, and it has many photographs, it probably has to be taken seriously as the #1 photographic case in UFO history.
Soon after the photos were taken, Brazil's president, Juscelino Kubitschek, ordered them released to the press. His action stands in stark contrast to the apparent secrecy of official UFO inquiries in the United States, beginning with the Roswell incident in 1947. Even today, requests for government records are routinely refused. Documents that are released are often censored to the point of uselessness. Perhaps it is no surprise that many suspect a government cover-up and conclude that unidentified flying objects may indeed originate somewhere other than Earth. Large numbers of UFO sightings are reported near top-secret installations, airfields, test ranges, nuclear power plants. Why these destinations? What are UFOs looking for? Should we call them friend or foe? We search the skies for the true intentions of these mysterious intruders. Next. The United States has suffered the indignity of invasion only rarely in its history. During the War of 1812, British troops overran Washington, D.C. and actually set fire to the White House. But for more than a century, no one else dared to trespass until the morning of December 7th, 1941. In the end, Japan paid dearly for its ambition, and American armed forces avenged their shame at being caught unawares. With the end of World War II, the Soviet Union emerged as America's most threatening adversary. The Soviet detonation of an atomic bomb in 1949 and the sheer size of its armed forces kept the United States military in a perennial state of alert. In July of 1952, during the administration of Harry Truman, Washington, D.C. appeared to be the target of airborne intruders. But the prowlers weren't Soviet fighter planes. They seemed to be UFOs.
Perhaps the most important sighting of all time was the so-called Washington merry-go-round.
On two weekends in 1952, July 19 and 20, and July 26 and 27, UFOs were tracked by radar and seen by numerous individuals over Washington, D.C. and its environs. People at Andrews Air Force Base and at Washington National Airport went outside and could actually see objects in the sky that matched positions of blips on the radar scopes. And the net result of it was, for a couple days there, UFOs seemed to have had their way over the skies of Washington.
On the third day of the sightings, as operators tracked the mysterious signals, curiosity suddenly turned to panic. The objects were heading toward the prohibited airspace over the Capitol and the White House itself. The Pentagon ordered jets from an airbase in Delaware to intercept the intruders. Al Chop was the Air Force's civilian spokesman on UFO issues. He was called to the radar room at Washington National as the dramatic incident unfolded.
We were observing about 4 or 5 known flights and about 12 to 14 UFOs. And we saw the flight coming in from Delaware. We could see them on the radar scope, and the moment they came on the scope, all the UFOs disappeared.
The fighter planes patrolled the empty skies for some 20 minutes, but there was nothing to intercept. However, when the jets returned to base, the UFOs promptly reappeared on radar.
And then when they came back, after the interceptors left, the fact that they immediately came back on the scope, I was very apprehensive.
Again, jets were sent aloft. One pilot reported seeing the UFOs, which he described as blue and white lights. Then he reported that they were closing in.
We could also see them on the radar scope, and we could see his return and the unknowns grouping around him. And he said, "They're all around me." And then he said later on, "What shall I do?" Well, what could we tell him?
After a few minutes, the UFOs pulled back and then disappeared. The standoff was over. However, the extended episode had stunned the nation.
That sighting has never been adequately explained. Because it happened in Washington, D.C., it alerted everybody right on up to the President of the United States and caused a national press conference by the Chief of Intelligence of the Air Force to try to calm everybody down.
We have received and analyzed between 1,000 and 2,000 reports that have come to us from all kinds of sources. Of this great mass of reports, we have, as of date, come to only one firm conclusion, and that is that it does not contain any pattern of purpose or of consistency that we can relate with to any conceivable threat to the United States.
General Sanford went on to explain that the sightings were merely an atmospheric anomaly, an inversion layer. Radar signals had bounced off this layer and picked up ground images of cars and buildings. Somehow, experienced radar operators at 3 different locations had misidentified them as UFOs. The press dutifully took down the story.
They bought the explanations. It was still standard practice, and it was for many years, to accept whatever the government said about flying saucers, no matter how foolish it was when you looked at it carefully.
The people at Washington National Airport and at Andrews were expert radar people and personnel. They'd been there for many, many years and could easily differentiate between ground clutter and true metallic objects. I mean, if they couldn't, they shouldn't have been radar operators.
The senior radar air traffic controller at Washington National Airport, Harry Barnes, wrote his own account of the so-called Washington merry-go-round.
He describes the objects as making right-angle turns, as hovering, as reversing their course and moving back upon their path. One radar tracked the objects as moving at approximately 7,000 miles per hour. He had never seen objects maneuver like this in his years of being over a radar scope. He didn't know what they were.
There were a few others who did not believe the objects were simply a product of unusual weather conditions.
At that time, I was convinced that these things were interplanetary machines of some kind, mainly because of what happened that night in the radar room at Washington National Airport. I'm convinced that those objects were real. We don't know what they are, and we don't know where they come from, but they are there.
Of course, it's entirely possible that the military didn't really believe its own explanation of the UFOs.
No fighters could catch up with these things, and they outmaneuvered the best that the military had to throw at them. Obviously, the people who were in charge of Air Force projects and Air Force intelligence at this time were not idiots. They were very, very smart people, as they are today. And I think they probably thought, once they appeared on Washington, oh my God, this is the holiest of holies. Now they're hovering around the White House and the Capitol. What can we do? Well, the answer turned out to be that they could do absolutely nothing. But it probably had to provoke a whole lot of consternation in the official quarters. But I can't believe that they wouldn't have been interested in, at some level, trying to find out what is going on.
It's a national defense concern. There was a technical report that said it's the most classified subject in the United States, even more so than the H-bomb. That's going pretty far. That's taking it very seriously.
In the decades after the Washington National incident, aerial sightings were reported more frequently and all across the country. Some episodes were even recorded on tape.
Dark 05, 327.1, 327.1.
On March 25, 1995, 3 crew members on America West Flight 564 saw something unusual in the sky over Bovina, Texas.
Texas 564, go ahead.
Yeah, off to our 3 o'clock. Get some strokes out there. Can you tell us what it is?
Right now, I don't know what it is right now.
It was 10:25 p.m. and the plane was cruising at 39,000 feet. The crew kept their eyes on a large object with flashing lights, visible below them. When they turned west, the object turned too. Here is the actual conversation between the flight's first officer and air traffic control.
564, did you pay that object at all on your radar? Cactus 564, no I don't. And talking to the 3 or 4 guys around here, no one knows what that is. We've never heard about that. But nobody's painting it at all? Okay, Cactus 564, say again? There's nothing on their radars on the other centers at all on that particular area, that object that's up in the air? It's up in the air? Affirmative. No, no one knows anything about it.
Eventually, the object moved in front of an active thundercloud. When lightning flashed, the crew got a better look.
What's the altitude about? I don't know, probably right around 30,000 or so, and it's with a drill that starts from going counterclockwise, and the length is unbelievable.
The airline crew was seeing something that ground radar was not picking up. Air traffic controllers alerted Cannon Air Force Base in eastern New Mexico to check if military aircraft, or perhaps weather balloons, were known to be in the area.
Cannon 21.
Cannon, go ahead.
Hey, do you guys know if there was anything like a tethered balloon or anything released that should be above tie band?
No, we haven't heard nothing about it.
Okay. Guy at 39,000 says he sees something at 30,000 that the length is unbelievable and it has a strobe on it.
Uh-huh.
This is not good. Okay.
What does that mean?
I don't know. It's a UFO or something. It's that Roswell crap again.
The desert just outside Roswell, New Mexico, was the site of a mysterious aircraft crash in July of 1947. Some 50 years later, the name Roswell had become synonymous with UFOs. And like Roswell, the experience of Flight 564's crew is still unexplained. Though crew members stick to their story, they prefer to remain anonymous.
There's a lot of confusion, a lot of hesitancy about even reporting something like this, even in FAA, even in military. They're going to think we're crazy. I don't want to be grounded. I'm risking something here. And a lot of airline pilots feel that way too. Why should I report this? I don't want to be under a medical microscope here. I'm not losing my mind.
Airlines don't like to employ people who see strange things. If you have a reputation in your company or your Air Force squadron as being the guy who saw the UFO from your F-18, I'm not sure I want to fly wing with him, you see. It's a subtle thing. Again, it goes back to denial. It's easier just to deny it and to say, all right, he's an oddball. Or she just saw something that just couldn't be seen, so she's probably not as reliable as she should be.
The fear of ridicule or retribution has kept many UFO eyewitnesses silent. Still, some do step forward, at times with extraordinary revelations. UFOs Then and Now will return in a moment here on the History Channel. Shag Harbor is a small fishing village on the east coast of Canada. It is a peaceful place where the locals focus on the sea, not the sky. But in 1967, a dramatic UFO incident upended Shag Harbor's quiet ways. It was October 4th, 1967, when 2 of the townspeople en route to their homes spotted something strange above the tree line.
My friend and I were talking as I was driving, and all of a sudden my friend said, look at those lights in the sky.
When we first seen them, they looked like they were stopped. Of course, we were driving in the car and we couldn't tell if they were stopped or if they were moving or what they were.
And after we lost sight of it and we went around the corner, we gained sight of it for a few more seconds, then we lost sight of it again.
I know I was scared when I first got out of the car because I wasn't very long getting into the house, like to get my father and get him to come out and have a look at it. And I was kind of hoping that it would stay there long enough for him to see it, and it did.
And I come home and I told my mother about it, and first question, of course, was you drinking? And I said, no, I don't think so.
Smith and Kendrick weren't the only ones to see the strange lights. Many of the locals watched as they flickered off and on. Suddenly, the luminous object turned on its side and plummeted into the harbor waters. Eyewitnesses rushed to notify the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP.
The people who initially arrived on the scene, the civilians who were called in to aid the RCMP, concerns were for survivors. Most people saw this thing occur from a distance, and it was initially thought that perhaps it was an airplane crash. But what the eyewitnesses saw, or in this case what RCMP officers saw when they arrived on the scene, there were at least 3 officers on the shoreline that at least saw a pale yellow light moving on the water. They all felt that it was something quite unusual.
The RCMP officers were not alone in observing the mysterious object. They were surrounded by a small gathering of spectators.
And we all seen it, the police seen it, and everybody was, I guess, startled by it, and none of the people that were there had ever seen anything like it before. And I know I hadn't.
The witnesses stood and stared, mesmerized by the strange light on the water. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished. A Coast Guard cutter was summoned, but local fishermen, already on board their vessels, headed for the spot where the light had last been seen. They were looking for survivors, but the only clue that anything had happened that night was a thick layer of an unknown substance.
There was a great bubbly foam, and it was yellow, nothing I had ever seen before. You couldn't smell no odor or anything, and we went about probably 3 lengths of the boat, and we ran out of it. And we turned the boat around and came back into it, and we ran out of it again.
The foam, like the lights, eventually disappeared. When it was obvious there was no further sign of distress, the search ended for the evening. By the following morning, the RCMP had already made contact with nearby military bases. They were hoping to find a reasonable explanation for what they'd seen. There was none. This left the small town of Shag Harbor to become big news.
It's a headline story throughout the North American press and beyond. And in that, it was said quite clearly, there were statements made by personnel at Canadian Forces headquarters in Ottawa saying that, yes, indeed, we are searching for the crash of what we believe to be an unidentified flying object. This is one of those rare cases where something indeed real has gone into the water, and it's not an aircraft, and it's not space junk. This was an official statement.
Canadian Armed Forces clearly stated that the object was officially a UFO. But the question of where it went after hitting the water was still a mystery. Canada's Department of National Defence was determined to find out. Military authorities ordered an underwater search. Within hours of the sighting, a Navy diving team was bobbing off the shores of the tiny fishing village, scanning the harbor bottom for debris. Meanwhile, Shag Harbor residents were stunned by what was happening in their small town. Those who had been the first to witness the lights were quickly gaining notoriety.
Everybody teased me a lot about seeing Martians and all this stuff, but I believe I see something. I did see something, there's no question about that. And what it was, that I don't know, but it was something. It was definitely something.
The people of Shag Harbor had no expectations. Roswell, although it occurred in '47, did not become, a story and a case until almost into the '80s, at least until '78. And they weren't influenced by that. Shag Harbor stood alone.
Nothing was found during the Navy's 3-day vigil. On the 8th of October, the search was canceled. Media interest began to wane, and life in Shag Harbor settled back to normal. But researchers now claim there is more to this incident than originally revealed. 26 years later, the case was re-examined and unofficial information began to emerge. The men from the original Navy diving team were the first to talk, and what a story they had to tell.
these men are claiming that there was a second operation, and their story has been corroborated by other armed forces personnel, that this UFO did not stay in the Shag Harbor area, but got away under the water and went up the coast and came to rest near Government Point. Now, at Government Point, you have a secret base. In those days, it was an American base on Canadian soil. To have an unidentified craft of any type sitting very near this facility and on some of their detection equipment would be a matter of extreme concern.
The Shelbourne military base at Government Point is now closed. But at the time of the sightings, it was a first line of defense against Soviet threats. Here, American forces monitored for submarine activity using a sensitive underwater grid. According to the unofficial story, an object triggered the detection device, and a flotilla of Navy vessels responded.
From our best information, 6 to 7 ships camped over the object for about a week, keeping an eye on it. Divers went down on it. One diver in particular makes no bones about it that this thing was an unidentified flying object, and there were things on it.
And as the men put it, there was still activity in these crafts. And they're absolutely certain that it was nothing from this earth, that it was a UFO. So this does go beyond the official record by quite a stretch.
According to researchers, other eyewitnesses have come forward, making this story difficult to dismiss.
So what evidence do we have of this happening? We have 3 to 4 people that tell us the story that this did happen. We've got the integrity of the witnesses, but that's, witnesses are, we don't have the smoking gun, that's for sure, but I think we probably have the gun, but we just don't have the bullets.
The unofficial story may never have confirmation, but it most certainly is complete. There is a beginning, a middle, and according to investigators, a surprising end.
One of the things I enjoy most about the story is its end, because I suppose you could say, ufologically speaking, it has a happy ending, unlike most of these stories. After these ships sat over this object for a week, the UFOs start moving again while still submerged under the water and move down the coast of Nova Scotia and out into the Gulf of Maine. Once in the Gulf of Maine, they surface and fly away. This was a genuine UFO event. And what does that mean? Yes, it was an unidentified flying object, but beyond that, it means that it's nothing conventional. There are certainly aspects of this that you cannot explain or explain away.
There is another episode involving a top-secret base, but this time, a high-ranking officer did come forward and sound the alarm when UFOs penetrated secure military airspace. UFOs Then and Now will return in a moment here on the History Channel. Weather balloons? Swamp gas? A flock of birds? The planet Venus? These are some of the UFO explanations proposed by the military over the years. Ironically, some of the most unusual UFO episodes have been reported by military personnel, perhaps because they are trained to carefully observe their surroundings. Or maybe there is something on military bases that is of interest to UFOs. Of all these troubling accounts, few compare with the experience of 2 of the world's most technologically advanced countries, the United States and Great Britain. This was Bentwaters Air Force Base, located 140 miles north of London. The Rendlesham Forest stands just outside the base. Bentwaters is now abandoned, but before the Soviet Union broke apart, it was a hub of top-secret activity. This was a joint base, shared by both the United States Air Force and England's Royal Air Force. It was also a place that played host to some of the strangest sightings ever reported.
I think the Bentwaters case is sort of a mainline, hardcore UFO case because it involves intelligent, educated people who are used to dealing with high technology. They're guarding it and securing it on their own base. They know aviation, they know weaponry. With security police who are trained to be good observers, they have to write all kinds of reports and defend what they say. And these people were puzzled, totally baffled by what they observed.
During the Cold War, Bentwaters was the largest tactical fighter wing of the free world. Perhaps its most noteworthy period came in December of 1980, when both the military and the local townspeople watched a dramatic UFO episode unfold. Some say it even rivals the Roswell incident of 1947. It was a cool, clear winter night when suddenly unfamiliar bright lights were spotted in the sky.
They sort of went up and down and moved sideways. They went this way and that and moved about. And this was fascinated. So I opened the front door and walked out into my front yard and to get a better view. And because my house was right at the end of the runway. So I stood there looking at them and I thought, it can't be aeroplanes because they'd landed in the forest.
Suspicious activity around the top-secret Bentwaters Air Base was always closely monitored. That night, neighbors could tell that they were not the only ones to experience the unusual episode.
I stood there for a few minutes to see what anything else would happen, and I could hear the commotion on the base. The wind was in that direction. I could hear people shouting, calling, and vehicles start up. And I wondered what the commotion was.
3 military patrolmen had also reported unfamiliar lights shining from within the forest. They requested and received permission to investigate beyond the base perimeter. As required, the 3 military police officers filed a report about what they'd seen.
I went in to collect the police blotters, the activity from the previous day and previous night, and the desk started laughing when I walked in. And I knew something interesting happened. And he told me by name the 3 individuals and said they were out in the woods chasing UFOs all night and laughed, as though he didn't believe it.
The sighting became a hot topic on the base. Though it was a source of amusement at first, the incident was taken somewhat more seriously as the hours ticked by.
There was concern in the powers to be, so to speak, on the base, not so much from the incident that occurred, but the ramifications and the distraction, I guess is the best way to put it. Because a lot of those security policemen were guarding some very, very important materials and had a very, very responsible job.
In order to get the base back to normal, the military brass dispatched a team of their own police to investigate. They hoped to find a reasonable explanation for the strange lights. But what they found only heightened concerns.
The next day, several of the police went out to the area and did find indentations on the ground, and they called the British PCs, the British police, who came out and wrote it off as hens nesting and rabbits burrowing. The interesting thing is there were 3 depressions which were equal distance apart, and they were all the same diameter, and the ground had been depressed the same depth. Quite interesting.
But the story did not end there. 2 nights later, the object returned. An American military team responded, setting out towards the forest. This time, investigators brought a Geiger counter to check for radiation, plus cameras and a tape recorder. Here is the actual recording of Colonel Halt as he encountered the mysterious object near Bentwaters Air Base.
Oh, I saw a yellow tinge in it too. Weird. It appears to be maybe moving a little bit this way. Yes, it's better than it has been. So, it's coming this way. It is definitely coming this way. The two pieces of it are shooting off. There's no doubt about it. This is weird. To the left.
Suddenly the object, the red object, started dripping like molten metal, just like coming out of a crucible. It dripped for, I would say, several minutes and suddenly exploded. There was no sound, just a poof, and broke into multiple white objects, and they all disappeared. Well, we were very puzzled at that time. We really didn't know what to think.
In the forest, the military squad detected some unusually high radiation levels. However, they found no other evidence to explain the situation. Then, the team observed a stunning display of lights in the northern sky. The dazzling lights proved to be a mere prelude to the stunning object that appeared in the southern sky.
Suddenly, the object to the south approached at very high speed, stopped, I would say a quarter, half mile above us, I can't really tell for sure, and sent down some type of a beam that fell right at our feet. It wasn't like an ordinary light that fans out. This came down straight like a laser beam. Illuminated the ground, a small circle, 8, 10, 12 inches in diameter, probably for about, I'd say, 10 seconds. Well, I was very concerned then. Are we getting a signal? Are we getting a warning? Or was this some type of a weapon that hadn't gotten us yet? Just as suddenly as it appeared, it clicked, disappeared.
3 hours later, the UFOs were gone, but mass confusion had taken their place.
We were sure nobody would believe this, and I say we were all thinking, wow, how are we going to cover this up? You know, what are we going to tell people? We can't tell the British. We can't go back and tell our bosses. They'll think we've all been out here in the woods drinking or something, which wasn't true, but there was great concern.
At the risk of ruining his reputation, Colonel Halt reported the incident to a superior officer the next day. He then turned in his audio cassette from the night before. After a staff meeting, the officer asked Colonel Halt to discuss the matter with the British liaison. The liaison was out of town, so Halt wrote a memo.
I wrote a memo which has become somewhat public, I guess, and kind of cleaned it up a little bit and abbreviated what happened.
Later in the night, a red, sun-like light was seen through the trees. It moved about and pulsed. At one point, it appeared to throw off glowing particles and then broke into 5 separate white objects, and they disappeared.
I expected a phone call or somebody to drop around to see me real soon. Nothing happened, and nothing happened. You know, days turned into weeks, and I kept asking, well, you know, is there any interest? And finally, it just became a non-issue.
Bentwater's commanders were content to let the matter drop, or so it seemed. But subsequent events would suggest that both the British and the American military regarded the incident at Bentwaters with the utmost gravity. UFOs Then and Now will return in a moment here on The Hit. Shortly after Christmas in 1980, a series of bold UFO approaches apparently challenged the security of a top-secret airbase north of London. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt, Deputy Base Commander of the Joint American-British Outpost, was among the eyewitnesses. However, his reports to other Bentwaters officers elicited no response. Still, there is evidence that the incident was not ignored. Indeed, far from it. The local townspeople were among those who noticed a change around Bentwaters.
I had customers come round to my garage who were military men. I asked what was going on, and they said, well, they weren't allowed to say. And I had 1 or 2 officer customers, and I asked them, and they weren't allowed to say either. I don't know why.
British UFO researchers Dot Street and Brenda Butler attempted to interview eyewitnesses, but were barred from the base.
They didn't say it was a UFO, they said something had happened in the forest. And when we came down and we actually tried to interview people, we were just stopped.
A breakthrough came for the UFO investigators when military personnel began to reveal a bizarre story that included more than just the sighting. They claimed an alien craft controlled by extraterrestrials landed in Rendlesham Forest and made contact with American officers. These curious reports have been ignored or denied by government and military officials. Despite this dismissive reaction, some say that the armed forces were keenly interested in the events at Bentwaters.
People did investigate. They did it from an arm's length. I was never formally debriefed, and I can't, to this day, can't believe that. I do believe some people crept around the base, so to speak. I do believe there were multiple agencies with a great deal of interest that probed discreetly. I can't explain. I've had people indirectly approach me trying to pry information out and to find out what was going on.
Military officials offered only conventional explanations for the extraordinary reports. Among them, that a satellite had fragmented as it re-entered the Earth's atmosphere.
I can't rule out that a satellite didn't fall or a portion of a satellite didn't fall in that area, but how would one account for the object moving through the trees? And the objects in the sky, they did not fall down. They stayed in the sky and moved about in sharp angular patterns, and there were 3 of them.
And indeed, it does seem that some space debris did come through at around about the time concerned. But it should be remembered, of course, that the Bentwaters incident occurred over a series of nights.
Another explanation for the sighting was refraction of the beam sent out by a nearby lighthouse.
Clearly, something extremely unusual happened. The skeptical explanation that it was the lighthouse light reflecting strangely through the woods doesn't make any sense, because why hadn't they encountered that problem before since? If it's this lighthouse, the atmospheric conditions would have been such that at some other point it would have happened, but it never did. So you have something going on there that is inexplicable in the mundane. You've got very credible people who are charged with guarding a facility who cannot explain it, and if these people are incompetent, we better get them out of there.
But none of the military personnel said to be involved were removed from the base. And publicly, it seemed both American and British officials were not anxious to pursue the matter any further.
The corporate view of the British Ministry of Defence about the Bentwaters case is simply that the case was looked at the time and was not judged to be of any defence significance. Well, I've not seen that borne out by any analysis. It certainly seems to be an example of bureaucracy gone mad if you have something like this happen and people blandly say it's of no defence significance.
Years later, the official position concerning the Bentwaters incident was revisited. This time it was brought before Parliament by no less than a former British Chief of Defence, Lord Hill Norton.
Either the Americans, and indeed the deputy base commander, were hallucinating, or they believed that something had landed there, and they had taken photographs and records of it. In either event, it must be of interest to the defense of the United Kingdom.
Despite such pronouncements, the military kept quiet about the incident at Bentwaters.
Oh, there's no doubt in my mind it was some type of a cover-up. And I think there were some misleading stories put out. Somebody didn't want the general public to be aware of what had happened.
Some 2 decades later, all physical evidence supposedly gathered during the incident is missing. No photographs have been found, although 3 separate search teams took pictures. And the military has no comment about the Geiger counter's high radiation readings in Rendlesham Forest. Perhaps the incident at Bentwaters Air Base in December of 1980 will never be fully explained. However, those who were directly involved have reached their own conclusions.
I think something totally out of the ordinary happened, something that we don't have an explanation for, and I'd certainly like to have one. Have we been visited? Perhaps. There certainly was some type of intelligent control over what we saw. I don't think there were little green men on board or whatever, and I really can't explain it. I'm firmly convinced there was some type of intelligent control.
The baffling episode at Bentwaters is but one on a long list of sightings that seem to merit an in-depth and impartial investigation. Some of the most credible of these reports point to UFO penetration of sensitive defense installations. But there is one place on Earth where military authorities are said to have actually examined alien spacecraft: the forbidden American airbase known as Area 51. The peculiar events at Roswell in July of 1947 seem to have established a pattern for government handling of the UFO issue in the United States. The more officials denied the existence of UFOs, the more it appeared they had something to hide.
In the 50s, there was the belief that the U.S. Air Force had proof of some sort that these were alien spaceships and was covering it up to prevent panic. That, in fact, the government not only knows about flying saucers, but is in cahoots with the aliens, that there is a technology exchange going on.
In the years immediately after Roswell, the Army Air Force designed and tested a number of saucer-like craft, but none appeared to be of alien origin, nor were they especially flight-worthy. However, in recent decades, suspicion that the government was test-flying captured alien spacecraft has begun to surface again. Attention focused on an ancient dry lake bed deep in the desert of Nevada, at the heart of the Nellis Air Force Range. It is a top-secret test site known as Area 51.
There's a new body of folklore growing up around UFOs, and this is associated with Area 51, which is part of the Nevada test site. And the story is that flying saucer technology is being tested and flown in extraordinarily advanced aircraft that are being developed there. There doesn't seem to be any question that there are extraordinarily advanced aircraft being test flown there, and this has been going on for some years. Area 51 was the development site used for the F-117 stealth fighter. U.S.-operated MiGs have flown from that area. These are extraordinary vehicles, and if you had seen, say, an F-117 in flight before it had been publicized, you would not have known what to make of it. It would have been a UFO in a very real sense, an unidentified flying object.
The stealth fighter is truly an incredible aircraft which few could even dream of in the 1970s. To observers near Area 51 at that time, it would have appeared surprisingly alien and worthy itself of a flying saucer report.
What's really interesting is that as long ago as 1947, people were reporting the boomerang-shaped UFO, which now looks very much like what is being flown as part of the stealth technology. It is interesting that certain kinds of aircraft that undeniably exist look very much like what people reported as UFOs for many years.
Some believe that the source of such technology is alien. If it is, then many trace the source back to Roswell in 1947 and the government's supposed cover-up of the spacecraft that crashed there. The sensational UFO stories associated with Area 51 have made this remote site a mecca for the curious. Visitors to this spot are monitored from the restricted airspace above and by ground vibration sensors that detect their unwelcome approach. The surrounding mountaintops hold still other devices that scan for any movement below. Once they are alerted, private security forces move in to discourage the curious from getting closer. For those who defy these measures, trying for a glimpse inside, there is one last chilling warning. Deadly force will be used if you come any closer. Persistent rumors about alien technology prompted the investigative arm of Congress to reopen the Roswell case in 1994. The General Accounting Office, or GAO, searched for all records related to the events of 1947 and then issued a report on their findings.
The General Accounting Office report is brief, like most of their reports, and it simply describes what they did to try to discover what happened at Roswell, which was contact the usual suspects, the CIA, the FBI, the National Security Agency, and so forth, and ask if they had information on Roswell, and ask to see certain records there. But essentially, they couldn't find any documents on Roswell at all, period.
In fact, the GAO revealed that every document relating to Roswell had been destroyed illegally. But even in their absence, these missing papers suggest there may be something to the story.
When you really look carefully at the phenomenon, there's no question that some UFOs are alien spacecraft, that some government officials have known this since 1947, and this is the biggest story of the millennium. Also, I think we need a new generation of journalists who will give this story the attention it deserves. If we spent 1/10 the effort that was spent on Monica Lewinsky on getting to the truth about flying saucers, we all know what was going on in 6 months.
Who was responsible for destroying the Roswell papers? No one has yet been named. But now the years are passing, and those who hid the truth about UFOs may never be identified. Perhaps the more important question is, what were they trying to hide?
Now, an exclusive offer from the History Channel. You can own the complete 4-hour special presentation, UFOs Then and Now, on 2 video cassettes for $39.95 plus shipping and handling. Call 1-800-708-1776 or order online at historychannel.com.